welcome so much to our first ever hybrid Think Better event. I can't tell you how nice it is to be here with real people in 3D. It's frankly awesome. We have learned some great things during the pandemic. One of the great things we learned is that it's terrific to be around other people. Who would have guessed that? It's great to be around other people. We have also learned, though, that there are some benefits to giving these talks virtually in that we can make them a lot more inclusive. We can bring lots more people into these events than we'd have otherwise. So in addition to the 500 or so of you here right now, I would also like to welcome some number of the 4,500 people who registered for this event over Zoom. Hello to all of the Zoomers here. We're going to try to keep doing that in these events as we go forward through. I trust that you will let us know. So the purpose of this program, of this talk series, this Think Better series, is try to introduce how and explore how insights from behavioral science can be used to shape society, government policy, business, and improve individual lives in meaningful ways. We've got no better speaker for this tonight than our own Richard Thaler, who's frankly responsible for all of this that we do here. Our next Think Better event will be at the Lakeshore Center downtown in February, where we'll be hearing from one of our new Booth faculty, Alex Todorov. This series is just one of the things that the Center for Decision Research does here at Booth as we try to support behavioral science. One of the other things that we do that's a little more visible is we also run a discovery center and working lab at 224 South Michigan called MindWorks, and I encourage all of you to go down there and visit if you want. We had the behavioral science MBA group. I think some of you are here just visiting last week, and we'd love to see more of you down there. It's one of the few places you can go to learn about behavioral science, arguably the only place you can go to learn about behavioral science and also contribute to it as a participant in one of our experiments at the very same time. You can learn more about our efforts there by going to mindworkschicago.org if you're interested. So, on to tonight's event. So earlier today, I was talking with Richard about this talk tonight, and he said that the cliche that some folks don't need an introduction was true about him. Indeed, it is true about him. So I'm not going to give an introduction to him. You know about the work he's done and the awards he's received, but I am going to tell you a story that will give you just a little bit of insight into what he's like behind the scenes. Personal story. So when I was coming out of graduate school, young person, didn't know a lot. I was coming out of a psychology department. I had applied here for a job, and I was graciously offered one. And Richard had a sense that I was a little nervous about coming to a business school because, like many folks who come from psychology departments doing behavioral science from a psychology perspective, we have stereotypes about what folks like you, that is MBA students, are like in business schools. And the stereotypes are ones you probably know well. They're not necessarily positive, that folks are here to make lots of money and they're just greedy and very self-interested. And he was very sensitive to that because he didn't frankly think it was true. And so we were sitting in his office over in Rosenwald, and I remember him telling me that, hey, let me tell you about this new research that I'm doing. And the research was focused on how to help folks solve one of the big financial challenges in their lives. That is not becoming poor in retirement, helping people to save enough money for retirement. And that program, that line of research, known as Save More Tomorrow, became one of Richard's significant contributions to the field and positive contributions to the world. And he noted, isn't that a good thing to be doing? That the intent, the point of that story was to point out how you can use a basic understanding of psychology, what he referred to at the time as simple kindergarten level psychology, which I don't think is quite true, but that's how he's always described it. You can use a basic understanding of how humans behave to help folks do better, to help people do more good in their lives, to help achieve their goals, to create better societies, and so on. And that's frankly what he's been trying to do throughout all of his career. His goal of his research, the contributions he's made to economics, has not been to show economists how stupid people are. It's to show economists how human people are, with our strengths and our weaknesses, in order to design models and policies and approaches to help people live better lives than they would otherwise. The goal of the research that he's done and the contributions he's made and the things he's tried to do to economics and to psychology is for good. And so it's no surprise that if you are lucky enough to get one of his books, Nudge, from him, he will likely sign it, Nudge for Good. And in fact, he now signs his new book, Nudge, the Final Edition, which he will be talking about tonight. Keep Nudging for Good is how he signs it. And that was a watershed moment for me, that experience in his office. I've thought about that meeting many, many times since. Thaler does great work, but I also consider him to be a huge force for good as well. Force for good here on campus and what he builds in the community and the faculty and the students and the folks that he brings here, but also for his contributions to behavioral science. He's a force for good. I'm proud to have him as a friend, as a colleague, and extremely proud to have him here as our speaker tonight. The plan for this event tonight is that Richard's going to come up and talk for about a half an hour or so, some amount of time, on some stuff from the new edition of the book. And then we're going to have a conversation. We're going to talk about some questions that we got from you, as well as some other things that we might think about on the fly. Thanks for being here tonight, Richard.
Okay, how's that? Good. All right, it's been nice. Thank you very much for having me. Aren't these cute? Let me start by saying that a bit about the title of this book. And the story is that when Cass and I decided to write this book, we didn't have a title. We had written a paper called Libertarian Paternalism is Not an Oxymoron. And so one of the publishers, there was not a great overwhelming demand to publish this book. One of the many publishers that turned us down said, you know, that word reminds me of the title, the proposal reminds me of the word nudge. Maybe that would be useful. So we stole that idea. The bad news about that title is that it suggests that it's a book about tweaks, right? Like nudges are little things. And that a lot of people have the impression that that's what this field is about. And so one of the things I'm going to do tonight is try and disavow of that, although I will start with some tweaks. The title I would like, and I argued for this as a subtitle the first time and later, is The Gentle Power of Choice Architecture. I lost both times, but that would be my favorite subtitle for this book and even for this talk, although nobody would have come if we had. So here's my favorite book cover of all time. Look at the teapot and think about it. If you're not laughing, you haven't thought about it. Think about trying to pour from this teapot. This is the way many things in life are organized. It's because, and sort of to pick up on Nick's kind of introduction, the people who design many of the products we use and many of the software, much of the software we deal with, have forgotten that there are going to be humans using it and that they're going to want to pour from this teapot, and it would be a good idea to have the spout and the handle on different sides. So who who are choice architects? We're all choice architects. If you go to a restaurant, the chef decides what is going to be cooked, but somebody has the job of writing that stuff down and organizing it. And how you do that is going to matter. What are the categories? Is soup a special category? Is pasta a special category the way it is in Italian restaurants? Within category, how is stuff ordered? Sometimes it goes up by price. There's an infinite number of ways of organizing it, and it's all going to matter. Same with store layouts. If you go into a grocery store, if it's a big fancy grocery store, they've paid somebody, a store walking architect. I don't know what their actual title is, but there's somebody whose job it is to get you to walk through the store in a profit maximizing way. The milk is in the back because everybody goes and buys milk because that spoils. So you want to make sure you have to walk a long way to get to the milk. And you want to make sure you walk by expensive stuff that's tempting. And we as faculty are choice architects. We construct a curriculum, so courses from which you choose. And there's a very convoluted process by which we do that. And then each professor designs a course, what you should read, in what order, how to think about it. We're all choice architects. Now, there are good designs and bad designs. This teapot is magnificently bad. Here's the most famous nudge of all time. If you can't see that, I'm going to give you a blow up. So this is a urinal from the Amsterdam International Airport, and some genius etched the image of a housefly, and they report, we've been unable to get the data, so this may not replicate, but they claim spillage has been reduced by 80%. If any of you are the parents of young boys, I hear Cheerios can serve the same purpose. So that's a good example. That's an example of good design. Here are some bad designs. Right, so it's somebody's job to create those labels, right? You know, they have you had one job. Somebody had that job. They shouldn't have that job anymore, but so here's a nudge that appears in both of the versions of this book. And it's a nudge I experience every day that I come to work, because I live in Lincoln Park. This is Lakeshore Drive. You have to venture all the way up north. There's a very sharp curve just as you go past downtown, and it's very dangerous. In fact, this is going north, and the curve is just about to come. The guardrails on the right side going north right now are completely destroyed by several bad accidents. So notice there are signs. There are signs on the road before we get to this saying 25-mile-an-hour speed limit. But then the smart, clever nudge is drawing these lines. So what have they done? These are not the lines that make the car jostle, and there's no, they're paint, so you don't feel anything. But the lines get closer and closer together, which creates the illusion that you're going faster. And no matter how many times you go down that drive, your instinct is to hit the brake. Oh, I'm going fast. That's good, right? That's exactly what you want people to be thinking. Now, it's not enough. People still wipe out on that curve, but according to the city, fewer people do after they do. And some evidence is they've repainted these lines several times in the 13 years since we first wrote about it in Nudge. So what are some bad versions of this? You could paint lines just at random places on Lakeshore Drive. You could paint lines everywhere. You know, if lines are good, why not more lines? You could paint lines at the safest places on the drive. You could put up signs every 100 meters announcing the new name of Lakeshore Drive. And that there's a view of Lake Michigan out the window, right? Or all kinds of things you could do. Now, suppose that what your job is you want people to be less likely to get fooled by phishing expeditions on the internet. And so your job is to prevent that. So what could you do? A good design would be, and if your concern is you don't want people to open emails that they think are from Booth, but aren't, because you work for Booth and you don't really care if they get scammed by some guy in Nigeria who's got a kidnapping. You care about stuff that happens here. So a good thing to do, and we actually got an email this week warning us about a phishing thing, somebody claiming to be the new president and wasn't. That's smart. That would be good. Here's something that wouldn't be as good, which would be to label every email that's not from Booth with the word external, right? Nobody would do that, right? Do that, but don't label emails from alumni who have Chicago Booth addresses. All of you students that are Booth students have Chicago Booth addresses. You get to keep that for life. That you can decide for yourselves whether that's Booth being generous or wanting to make sure they can get in touch with you for the rest of your life. It could be either of those. So we have 50,000 alumni who have Chicago Booth email addresses. I got an email from one of them recently. It's not labeled external. So we're labeling emails from my wife, from Danny Kahneman, who I've been communicating with for 40 years, from my kids. They're all labeled external. An email from an angry student who's still mad at the grade I gave them 25 years ago, that is not labeled. This is sludge. And one of the innovations in the new version of Nudge is we talk about nudging for good and sludging for bad. And this is in the latter category. So the real substance of, I'm not going to try to give a talk about the whole book. I'm going to make one point aside from that one. This is my second point. I'm going to take a deep dive on defaults. Now, first, what's the definition of a default? A default is what happens if you do nothing, right? So you're sitting in your chair. The default is that you stay sitting in the chair, right? That's what happens if you do nothing. If you lean back too far, something else might happen, but that requires some action on your part. If you do nothing, you will remain in that state, okay? Now, one of the most important experiments about default options occurred in pension saving, something that Nick talked about earlier. In the early days of 401k plans, and most of you are too young to know this, but 401k plans are very new. They were created in the mid-'80s. And employees weren't very good at signing up, even though it was a really good deal. In most companies, the employer was matching contributions 50 cents on the dollar up to 6%, or sometimes dollar for dollar. You'd have to be an idiot not to join, but many people didn't join. So what was the solution? Change the default. So the original plan was, when you're first eligible, you get a big pile of forms to fill out. If you want to join the 401k plan, fill out these forms and decide how much you want to save and how you want to invest the money. If you do nothing, the default was you get nothing. So the switch was called automatic enrollment. And then under this plan, you get a form, one-page form, that says you're eligible for the pension plan, and if you do nothing, we're going to put you in, and you're going to save this amount and invest in this. If you want out, then you got to fill out this form saying you don't want this benefit. Well, that really works. In the first study of this, which was done by a woman called Bridget Madrian, who was at that time a faculty member here at Booth, she found that enrollments within the first year jumped from 50% to 90%. Woohoo! Right? That's great. The bad news is, and this is the main point I want to make, is getting defaulted into something is not the same as choosing it. So if you automatically enroll people into the pension plan, you have to enroll them into something. So a saving rate and an investment plan. The company she was studying chose a 3% saving rate and put all the money into a money market account. Now, that sounds dumb. It wasn't as dumb as it sounds. The government had not blessed other kinds of default investment vehicles, and there's a long story about how 3% became blessed. But anyway, that's what they picked. And most people took it. So if they're defaulting you into it, yeah. Now, before this, the people who went out of their way to sign up, most of them invested 6% and invested mostly in stocks. Right? So now there's good news and bad news. We have more people in the plan, but some of those would have been saving more and saving in something that offers a higher rate of return. Did we do more harm than good? Well, that's a matter of opinion. So automatic enrollment per se was not great. What were the solutions? Well, Nick mentioned one. A former student of mine and I created something we called Save More Tomorrow, which was increase the contributions steadily over time, and that will get the savings rate back up. And create better default investment vehicles. That took some nudging the Labor Department, but they finally agreed to that. And so that's where we ended up. Okay, but notice the main point here is enrollment by choice is not the same as enrollment by default. Now I'm going to give you 3 examples to elaborate on that. Organ donations, insurance choices, and Swedish Social Security. They sound boring, but they're not that bad. This is a graph that was created by 2 friends of mine, one of whom was a PhD student here, at least partially, Eric Johnson. And it's been called the most famous graph in social science. Here's what it shows. There are 2 kinds of organ donation systems in countries. One is called presumed consent. And the idea is we're going to presume that you're willing to have your organs transplanted unless you do something. The other, which is the system we use in this country, it's called explicit consent. You have to do something, like when you get driver's license, they ask you, do you want to be an organ donor? You say yes, okay? So it's a change of the default. And the reason this graph was so striking is the countries with the high bars are doing presumed consent, and almost everybody is giving their consent passively. And the countries on the left, where people have to sign up, not very many people are signing up. Okay? So people look at that, and Germany and Austria are right next to each other, kind of similar countries, at least they speak the same language, and very different results. So what's going on here? And the conclusion was, we can solve the problem of not having enough organs by changing the default. Well, not so fast. Remember, path dependence matters. The people who actively sign up to be donors are not treated the same way as the people who passively agree to be donors. They're treated very differently. And I don't have a place to put this water where the default option will be to stay and rest. So it turns out no country actually implements presumed consent, in the sense that there's no country where if you become brain dead, they come and take your organs. That plan doesn't exist. It used to be in this country, there was such a policy for corneas. They would, if they needed corneas and somebody died, they would take them. And I'm not sure they even told people, but they eliminated some kinds of blindness with this policy. I think there was a medical advance that made that no longer possible, but that's a conceivable policy. It's called routine removal. No one has adopted that. That would work. But that's not what we're talking about. Instead, when these countries that have adopted presumed consent, the rule is ask the family. Now, you go to a family, oftentimes, this is a sudden death, often an accident or a sudden heart attack. Family has no clue what the donor's wishes were because they didn't do anything. All they did is not sign some form. Now, most of you are young. Imagine what inference your parents would take from your failure to fill in some form. Probably none. And that would probably be accurate, right? Our failures of omission are not very telling about our underlying preferences. Well, does presumed consent save lives? No. So the bar on the graph is organs transplanted per 100,000 deaths in opt-in countries. The one on the right is opt-out countries. The higher is better. This is the real graph. It's not famous, but this tells us the right answer. Second example, if there are any employees here, this is open enrollment period. You have to choose your health insurance plan. There was a very large employer that decided a good choice architecture would be to give everybody all of the options. So here's what they did. There were insurance policies that had 4 attributes: deductible, prescription copay, co-insurance rate, maximum out-of-pocket cost. There were 3 or 4 options in each one, 48 possible choices. And they said you can have any combination you want. Now, to an economist, this is perfect, right? It's like saying in the 401k plan, there aren't these mutual funds. Here's the global stock market. Pick stocks, right? Choose your best portfolio. It can't be better than that, right? So how did that work? Not so good. Now, there was a default plan here, but hardly anybody took it. What they did take, a majority of them took a plan that there was another plan that strictly dominated it, meaning that no matter how much healthcare they consumed, they would pay more. The mistake that they made was they chose too low a deductible. Okay, here's one useful thing you're going to learn tonight, if you remember it. When in doubt, take the highest deductible. In this case, switching from a $750 deductible to $1,000 would save you $372. So we have a new chapter called Don't Insure the Small Stuff. But the point is that here's a choice architecture that seems infinitely flexible and great, but gives lousy outcomes. And hardly anybody took the default. Why don't they take it? I call this salad bar choice architecture. If somebody points you to a salad bar and says, make a salad, you don't say, nah, I'll take a Caesar, right? Because you're being told, look, go make a salad. And it turns out if there's a salad already made that's better than the one you're going to make, you should take that, but you won't. Okay, third example. Sweden in 2000 decided to partially privatize their social security system. And they gave people some funds to choose from. Now, which funds should they include? They decided to let any fund that met EU regulations enter, and they got 456 options. I call this choice architecture by accident. It's not that anybody thought 456 is the right number of options in a savings plan, but that's what free entry got them. That's what they got. Now, there was a default fund, and it was a very good one. In fact, many Swedish economists I know picked this by choice. But they also decided to have a big campaign, choose for yourself. The political party in power at that time, this is going to be a little hard to get, but this was like the Swedish version of a libertarian party. So huge Social Security, but you ought to pick your own fund. Anyway, that was what the policy was. And fund companies were also allowed to advertise. So this is a battle of the nudges. There's a default, that's a nudge. There's an advertising campaign, that's a nudge. What wins? Here's one of the ads that was run. Harrison Ford says you should pick whatever this fund is. Turns out the ad campaign won. If you're in marketing, it's a victory for marketing. So 2/3 of the people picked their own funds. But then after that, new people enter the system each year, young people and immigrants. What do? Well, the ones who picked the next couple of years had heard all the ads, but after that, almost nobody is picking for themselves. So what are people's preferences? That's a deep question that we don't have time to get into, but it's hard to say. Do people want to be portfolio managers or not? Kind of depends. Right now, there are almost as many funds as there are people choosing to invest for themselves each year. So one fund per person. That seems more than we need. There's also a lot of inertia. I'll give you two examples. One is they decided to add leverage to the default fund. 50% leverage. And that's the graph on top. Now, if you know what leverage is, it increases the risk by a lot. You'd think, gee, people don't want to invest in a fund that's 150% equities. They're going to switch. No, the activity on the bars on the right, below, you probably can't see the scale. That's hundreds. So 100 people noticed this and switch. So I actually gave a talk on this to the Swedish Parliament with this as the subject line. Then the second thing that happened is one of the active funds was caught cheating. They were caught not by a regulator, but by a newspaper. Here's a pro tip. If you're going to steal from your investors, don't buy the biggest house in Stockholm with a swimming pool and a helicopter. Okay, that's a good way to get caught. Well, again, you'd think people are going to get out of this fund. This is on the front page of the newspapers, on radio and TV. People are asleep, right? So, do nudges last forever? No. They do in Sweden. Whatever you start with, you keep. But each case is different. Okay, I think this is probably a good point to stop because I think we're running late. So why don't we stop and turn it over to Q&A. Was told to do one thing, sit in this chair when I'm done.
I'll note I had to direct you to that chair. That podium was horribly designed, I noticed, for holding your water there.
Yeah.
Terrible architecture.
Yeah. There's a thing like this high that would just get the bottle to spill all over you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so we collected some questions from you when you registered, that I have a few here, and I also wanted to follow up on a few things here too. So one of the big challenges with design is figuring out how to design to have the most positive impact on someone. And you highlighted here, in terms of design of choice or choice architecture, ways in which defaults have complicated effects on outcomes. It's easy to think about these simplistically. Defaults are things people tend to go with. So if I set the default, they'll do this thing, this outcome will happen. Clearly that's not quite right. There's a lot of variability. So how should we help folks think about that variability? What do you have to think about when you put a default in place if you'd like it to have a long-term impact that's actually meaningful and good for folks?
Well, look, I think a lot of times if you, I think, and this could be hindsight bias, I think I could have anticipated many of these things. I couldn't have anticipated whether the ad campaign would have beat the default, but I certainly would have predicted that the default will be picked lower. But the real thing is we have to do trial and error. So there's no, we can run experiments. It's hard to run experiments at the country level. I've been trying to convince central bankers that they should each respond to a financial crisis with a policy picked at random.
I'm sure that goes over really well.
Ben Bernanke,
Yeah.
no. Janet Yellen, no. Jay Powell, no. I'm 0 for 3, but somebody.
That's your control condition, or that's the whole condition?
Well, I had those handy, but
All right. So I've heard you say several times, both when we've talked and in talks that you've given, that the biggest problems in the world today are behavioral problems. About inequality, immigration, threats to democracy, distrust, on and on. And arguably the biggest one facing us as a species is climate change.
Yeah.
We've got a conference going on right now through November 12th in Scotland, the 26th UN Climate Change Conference of the Parties, or COP26. I'm curious if they were among the 4,500 registrants who are listening to us at the moment, what would you say to them? How can we best use behavioral science and the concept of nudging
That's certainly
help
an
us with
important
climate
question.
change?
And we have a whole chapter devoted to climate change in this book. And it starts by saying, we're not going to win this battle with nudging. And I put my economist hat on that my real economist friends let me borrow occasionally. And
Not us, not your psychology friends.
yeah, and I say we have to price carbon. I mean, and the IGM poll asks economists about this periodically. 100% of economists agree with this. It's about the only thing that you can get every economist to agree. You can argue about whether it should be cap and trade or a carbon tax, but if something is free, people consume too much of it. Just go to a wedding with an open bar and you'll see what happens. And that's the system we've had since humans took over this planet, is free carbon, and it's too cheap. So we should do that. Then nudges can help. And there are lots of nudges people have found that have effect sizes of on the order of magnitude of 2 or 3%. So one famous one is when you get your utility bill, you're told how much you're consuming compared to your neighbors. That lowers consumption by 2 or 3%. Now, that's not going to get us to carbon neutrality, but as in the book we quote our former colleague, President Obama, who used to like to say in the White House, better is good. So if we can reduce consumption by 2%, let's do it. If there are 5 ways to do that, let's do that. But we got to get the prices right first.
See, so there are big policy level effects that operate at the
Yeah, I mean, so many of the
business level.
decisions are being made by companies.
Yeah.
What kind of product to make, how to ship it. The decisions we make are small compared to how energy is produced, right? Coal versus wind is really big. If you adjust your thermostat, how much good that's going to do depends on how your electricity is being generated. So if we're going to get the big guys to make the right decisions, we've got to set the prices right. Setting the prices right also gives people the incentive for the technology change that I think is our only real hope. Yeah. So we need 100 more Elon Musks, not crazy ones, maybe, although, you know, but we need some, I believe there will be technological breakthroughs. Think of the miracle of the COVID vaccines that were produced in a year. There is no AIDS vaccine. 40 years later, there's no vaccine. So the fact that we got a vaccine in a year is a miracle. I think there will be breakthroughs, but it's more likely that we get a breakthrough if there's a big economic incentive.
If the prices are right.
Yeah.
So that brings us to the second question, the second big problem that we're thinking a lot about these days, which is COVID. And one of the folks here today, I think Richard Weiland, had a question, which is, and this involves the notable resistance to the miracle that we have, the vaccines that all of us here have gotten. So the question from Richard was, why didn't nudges to get vaccinated work better?
Well, so here's my, we don't know fully the answer to this, but here's my take. There were 3 phases. The first phase is when the vaccines first were available. There were no nudges needed. It was maneuvering for who can get their vaccine first. Then there was a middle phase where nudging helped, giving people a free beer, having no appointments, bringing the vaccine to make it convenient. All the stuff you would think helped. I'm not sure we know by how much, because we were in such a rush to get people vaccinated. There was a lot of improvising. We'll probably know 2 or 3 years from now what worked and what didn't. And by the time people got around to running experiments, including me, we had reached stage 3, where the people who were unvaccinated had very strong opinions. And nudge wasn't going to do it. So I wrote a column in the New York Times back in the summer saying that the time for nudging is gone, and I approve of what we've done here at the University of Chicago. Mandate's not a nudge, but there are other universities. You don't want to be vaccinated? Go somewhere else. You want to work here? There's a help wanted sign in every building in Chicago. So, nudge was written as an alternative to rules and mandates. But there are some times that we have to make rules. In that column, I made the analogy with smoking. When I was a kid, you could smoke in any restaurant, and any good restaurant had a cigarette machine where you could buy cigarettes in case you ran out in the middle of dinner. You could smoke on airplanes. Restaurants thought if you didn't allow people to smoke, no one would go. Now, nobody would think of going to a restaurant that was full of smoke. So you don't have a right to smoke in public. So I don't think people should have a right to make me sick.
So this brings up an important thing to think about if we're thinking about using context as the situation to influence behavior, which is that not everybody's susceptible to situational influence. If there are strong internal forces, you really want to get the vaccine or you really don't, changing the context you're in or the way you sign up to get the vaccine or the message you receive isn't going to push you across the line that'll change your behavior.
Yeah, right.
So there's a sweet spot for people, right?
There's a sweet spot, and look, money wouldn't work much either. Some people are saying, I'll lose my job, I don't mind, right? And some people have said, oh, let's pay people $100 to get vaccinated. No, that's not going to work now. It might have worked in June, right? When you're at the hesitant.
Yeah.
And look, Katie Milkman, a colleague of ours at Wharton that we both know, Katie and I 2 years ago wanted to run an experiment on flu vaccines. And the experiment was, if you show up for your flu vaccine appointment, you get a lotto ticket. I was pretty sure that would work. We couldn't get permission to do it.
IRBs.
Yeah, IRBs. By the time we actually ran an experiment in June in Philadelphia with lotteries, but it was a little late, and we had raised $400,000, which we thought was pretty good, pretty expensive experiment. 2 weeks before we were ready to run it, Ohio announces $1 million lotteries every week. We got a precisely zero impact. Too little, too late.
So context and nudges have to be shaped not just for the context you're dealing with, but also the people who are in it.
Yeah.
So Stephen Matz wondered, how do you know when it's time to move from a nudge to a shove?
Well,
if you're trying to influence behavior.
I think it's cost benefit. I don't think so. Look, I'm normally in favor of nudges, and I would have preferred to live in a world where we didn't have to do anything further. Now, no country, as far as I know, has implemented a mandate for COVID vaccine. And even the University of Chicago, there's wiggle room, right? If you have a religious objection or many so-called mandates are really or you can get tested once a week. And at the country level, we don't have a mandate, right? So these are private level mandates. We have many mandates. You're not allowed to go beat somebody up. No matter how angry you are with me, you're not allowed to go hit me and you'd win. Right? So your fraud is against the law. Theft is against the law. Rape is against the law. So we have laws that are mandates. And this is a political decision.
So there's another way to think about getting the prices right for something like this. So you had talked about in climate change at the corporate level, but you could think about getting the prices right at the individual level. This is what marketers and folks who do pricing focus on. You could imagine doing that for COVID as well, which would also allow people to retain choice, which is that hospitals don't pay if you don't have a vaccine.
Well, yeah, you could do
That is,
that.
you internalize the cost.
I'm not sure that would be legal. But what I don't think would have been a good idea at any stage would be to announce a price that we're going to pay for you to be vaccinated. And the reason is, and I was arguing this back before we had boosters, I said, we're going to have boosters. And do we want people to think, okay, I'll get a booster when you give me the $500 you were offering back in August. And, now we have little kids. Do we, right? So I never knew what the right price would be, and I didn't want to set a precedent that this is something you had to pay people to do, because it suggests that it's risky. What's risky is not getting vaccinated.
So another question.
So I'm inconsistent. Prices aren't the answer to everything.
Well, I was surprised by your answer about not internalizing the cost. As you could also imagine insurance companies, they just, if you're not vaccinated, that's a risk, and so your insurance premiums go up, just like if you're a bad driver.
Hospitals have to take you if you're sick.
No, right,
So,
but your insurance company's rates.
They charge higher prices if you're smokers. It's a little hard to do that on the fly.
Okay.
As the Congress is discovering and trying to write tax law on the fly, it's harder than it looks.
So you talked a bit about sludge in the talk here.
Yeah,
it's one of your new chapters in this book. Was not a concept when you wrote the original. As far as I can tell, commenting on sludge takes up 72% of your activity on Twitter. And your definition of sludge is any aspect of choice architecture consisting of friction that makes it harder for people to obtain an outcome that will make them better off. That is the opposite of a nudge, which is making things easy to do the thing you'd want to do. Sludge is adding friction that keeps you from doing the thing that you might want to do. Josh Shalin inspired a question here, which is, it wasn't quite his question, but it's similar, is whether adding friction, making something harder to achieve, so you highlight the importance of making things easy, but can't we also have cases where adding some friction, sludge, at least in terms of adding friction, can produce good outcomes, can be a good nudge?
Definitely. So, in fact, Cass and I had debates on what the right definition ought to be. And since sludge is a term I invented on Twitter, I claimed that's literally true. And it's the slide I didn't have a chance to show, so I'm going to sneak it in. My big complaint is about companies that charge you, the companies that allow you to subscribe with one click, but to unsubscribe, you have to call.
Like your unnamed UK newspaper.
Yeah, and unfortunately, many US newspapers, the Washington Post is a rare exception, but most of our leading publications do this. Cable companies, gyms. If I was in charge, there'd be a rule. You have to be able to unjoin the way you joined. And but I've been about as successful at convincing companies to adopt that policy as I've been on convincing central bankers to have random assignment of monetary policy. But I do think, and I think you're all business students, or many of you are. we talk a lot about corporate responsibility. For my company, I would be embarrassed to say that you have to spend a half an hour on the phone in order to unsubscribe to my newspaper. I would want a newspaper people would want to subscribe to, and if they want to leave, go away. So I've never allowed a class I teach to be a requirement, because I always wanted to tell people, don't want to take this class, take something else. So I would do the same for a business that I owned, and I urge all businesses to live by good service and good product, and not by entrapping their customers and locking them in.
Amen to that. One more question. I want to be mindful of time. And this comes from Penka Bergman, who we both know well, who's the director of our alumni relations in London. So I presume she's joining us from Zoom. Hi, Penka. So Penka wondered, what's next for Professor Thaler? I'm consistently amazed by a guy who claims that he's so lazy to keep producing a book every few years that seems to change the world.
No, it's Danny who claims I'm lazy. You know.
So this is the last one of these by fiat, by the title itself. What's next? What are you excited about?
Yeah, well, there is another book.
You heard it here first.
Yeah, the first book I wrote was called The Winner's Curse. Mm-hmm. And it was a collection of anomalies columns. And it was kind of before economists wrote books. And it's gone out of press. And after the book was written, I wrote 6 more of these columns. And the publishers asked me to create a new edition and put the 6 new ones in. And I've recruited our colleague, Alex Emis, to do this with me. And each one, there's a big replication crisis. And it turns out every one of those anomalies fully replicates 30 years later. So what we're going to do is pretty much keep the columns as they were written, slight modernization, not update them, but add a coda saying what's happened and report on whether it replicates. But spoiler alert, they do.
Good. All right, that'll be great. And good for Alex to be doing that with you too. Okay, thank you so much for this. Thank you for coming. Thanks to all of you for coming.
Good timing.
And so what we're going to do now, I understand, is we're going to have a drawing for Richard's new book. We are going to duck out to avoid a rush of people up here due to COVID. Thanks so much, everybody, for coming. Hope to see you in February at our next one down at Gleacher with Alex Todorov. Thank you.
Good. If they want us to do that one.
Which way are we going?
We're going with Amy.
We're going with Amy, this way.
Oh.
If everyone can stay seated for a moment.